Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why I really dislike some of the studies we're seeing on muscle growth and strength lately, because a lot of them out there do involve partial exercises, they involve a lot of isolation work, and it's not really helpful to us. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And the reason we need to talk about this is because what you're seeing, a lot of you are seeing researchers who are trying to study hypertrophy, and again, guys like Schoenfeld's a perfect example. Actually, a pretty good guy. I like most of what he does. I just don't like the bias in the way he does stuff towards a bodybuilding end. And I do mean that. There is some personal bias there. And a lot of it has to do with some of the exercises that are selected and included in some of the studies. And the reason I say that is if we're going to be honest and we're going to really look at all the research that has accumulated over the years, because I mean, we could talk about training volume, and I'll probably discuss that in another video. There have been multiple meta-analysis and even long-term detailed studies looking at training volume, and those things don't conclude what some of the prominent researchers are saying right now, 2018 going into 2019, that it's not actually matching. There's a big discrepancy there. And what we need to look at, though, is that a lot of that has come from another way of looking at things. It has to do with some of the way that they train differently. But I think what we're seeing here is because isolation work and partials and all of this stuff is so popular in the bodybuilding culture, and you know, notice the quotations, because my definition of bodybuilding doesn't seem to match what a lot of the kids out here use, but it's a subculture there that exists. And there's a tendency to do a lot of fluff and pump and useless stuff, so therefore that's what they're throwing into a lot of these studies. So that's not helpful. And the reason I say it's not helpful is that we know that those things are inferior training stimulus based upon the accumulated body of knowledge of study after study after study looking at humans and athletes and trained people and everything else. Those things don't work. They don't produce effective muscle growth in the way that we would desire it. Yet this is what we're studying and mixing it in with effective training and trying to determine outcomes as far as frequency, volume, everything else. It's like we're catering the studies to the bodybuilding subculture and saying, hey, you guys are flat wrong with a lot of your shit. Maybe we don't need to be studying your bullshit. We need to be studying what we know works and fine-tune that instead of catering to this nonsense. Because we're not getting honest studies. We're only getting studies that say, okay, if you're going to do a bunch of partials and you're going to do a bunch of isolation work, or single joint exercise, because there is no such thing as isolation. That's a bullshit term also. Doesn't work, doesn't exist. Single joint versus multi-joint exercises instead of compound versus isolation. Much better term, easier to define. The problem we run into is that it's not helpful. This stuff doesn't build as much muscle. Therefore, you obviously need more volumes of it. Yeah, no shit. Less effective training stimulus, you have to do more of it to get results. It shouldn't be a difficult concept. You guys all know that when you pick up a weight. If you want to grow the same amount of bicep with a 20-pound dumbbell as a 40-pound dumbbell, you're probably going to have to do more reps with it. Pretty simple, right? Because it's less effective. 20 pounds is less effective than 40. You're going to have to do it more times to get the same amount of muscle. So, you know, and I'm not even talking about the guys who are struggling with the 40. I'm talking about the guys who can already do 10 with the 40. They're going to have to do a hell of a lot of reps with the 20 to see any growth. All right, this isn't a difficult concept. People understand it when we put it in terms of weight. But when we start talking about exercises, same concept applies, doesn't it? Here's what I mean. Partials stimulate less muscle growth. Even when you go heavier, it has been studied ad nauseum. This is not a point of contention. It's not a point of debate. Partial exercises don't produce as much muscle. I don't care whether we're talking about rack pulls. I don't care. Actually, deadlifts. I mean, we argue. I love the deadlift. But the deadlift doesn't work everything through a full range of motion. It's an amazing exercise because it puts so much strength on you. It's an amazing exercise because it recruits so many different muscles through the body so it can cause overall growth. But I mean, arguably, most of the muscles involved in the deadlift aren't being worked through in a full effective range of motion. Therefore, they don't receive maximum training stimulus. They get a secondary training stimulus from the deadlift, adding more workload to your already other exercises. So, I mean, even the deadlift has its problems, and it's probably tied for my favorite exercise of all time. And I'll be the first to admit it has problems from a hypertrophy perspective as far as that goes, because it is a partial exercise. It's just probably the most amazing partial exercise that exists. But let's not forget the fact that it's a partial, right? We know that it is. Objectively speaking, snatch, grip, deadlift, deficit deadlifts, things like that have a little more hypertrophic potential when they're programmed correctly. They do potentially. I hate to admit that, loving the deadlift, loving the conventional deadlift, I hate to admit that, but it's true. See, that's the point to where we have to set our bias to the side, right? We have to set our bias to the side. And that's a tough one for me to admit, but I have to, right? Because we've got to be honest with ourselves. Partials produce less muscle growth. And it's been found in studies that even when you increase the weight to make it proportionate, they just don't produce quite as much growth. They don't produce as much growth as an effective range of motion. Now, people need to understand that full range of motion is not always the same thing, because there are movements and things to where the full range of motion actually does disengage certain muscles and force you to use less weight. That's not a good thing, right? That's not a good thing. Like, we can argue with that on the squat, that the ass to grass squat compared to the parallel squat may not always work, only because a lot of the primary movers are already moving through their effective range of motion. And when we go too low, not only are we reducing weight on the bar, we have muscles that are disengaging, so they're getting less total work. They're getting less total work. Things like your hamstrings, for example. It's a perfect example. You're going to get less hamstring growth flat out. And the squat's already not an amazing hamstring exercise always. So, I mean, that's an example. But we know that a parallel squat produces a hell of a lot more growth in the quads than a half squat does, even when you put double the weight on the bar. A lot of you guys are like, what do you mean double? Yeah, a lot of you guys, if you were to actually squat the parallel, would be taking 200 pounds off the bar. Let's just be honest about it. Let's be honest about it. I see the gym squats. But it's a reality, guys. Longer range of motion usually has more growth potential. So when we start studying all these silly-ass partial exercises, yeah, of course they need more volume. Of course they need more workload. They're an inferior training stimulus. They can't produce maximal muscle growth as easily. You have to do more of them. Same thing when we throw all this isolation stuff in. Isolation movements don't produce as much muscle as compounds. We've got multiple studies at this point showing that inferior compound movements produce the same muscle growth when we plot it over time as the effective isolation movements. I mean, what more do you want to say? When we've got multiple studies showing that lat pull downs, a pronated grip lat pull down produces as much muscle growth in the bicep in multiple different demographics. It's been studied in novices, it's been studied in intermediates, it's been studied in scholarship athletes. The lat pull down produces as much muscle growth as a curl does in the bicep, even for people with several years of training experience. And that is not the best line of pull. It's not, no one's going to say that lat pull down is an amazing bicep exercise. We got a lot of other big compound movements that produce a hell of a lot more activation in the bicep on an EMG than a lat pull down. Yet when we study the growth, it works more. And it's working a lot of other muscles. So this is the problem we get into. Yeah, when you start throwing all these isolation movements in, sure, now we do need a lot more training volume. They work less muscles. And they don't always produce even the best muscle growth in the muscles they're targeting. They oftentimes don't. And they sure don't create the best strength. And what happens? We know that strength carries over into long-term hypertrophy also, because it allows you to continue to load longer. It allows you to progress longer. So this is a problem. When we're studying these things and then we try to use them as head-to-head studies on volume versus, I don't know, more effective exercises, it becomes difficult. Or the problem we have is that when you're studying volume and you do a study where you have a bunch of partials in isolation, and then you're doing a more moderate volume, but you're not doing just the effective exercises, right? What happens if we throw a parallel squat, a bench press, an overhead press, and a pull-up in, right? Let's even take the lat pull downs. You take those 4 exercises and you train them with a moderate volume versus adding a bunch of fluff and pump, and you start studying who gains more muscle. Do you guys see the problem here? you might find that those 4 more effective exercises, when they're taken to sufficient volume, crush the overall muscle mass, or at least equal people who are doing 3 times as many total sets per week with all the other stuff. Or you try to add it to it, you're going to find it's different. But when you're comparing volume of less effective exercises, and then we start looking at overall muscle growth, well, yeah, you're going to need more training volume because your exercise selection sucks. Your exercise selection sucks. How many of those are big barbell movements? How many of them are exercises where people are standing on their feet with a big weight having to support it? How many of those are exercises that are moving the body through space? Like a pull-up, a dip, a chin-up, a glute ham raise, right? These exercises that we know from decades of research in multiple countries put the most size and strength on you. Well, it's a problem. It's a problem when we look at this. And I think it's a waste of research. And I think it's research that's catering to bullshit training. So you can study, when you look at bullshit ineffective training, of how much of it do you need to do to get maximum muscle growth? Well, yeah, you need more because it's low quality. It's low quality training. But it gives you the mind-muscle connection, which has been shown in multiple studies to be less effective than compensatory acceleration, doesn't it? Internal cueing versus external cueing, which one activates the most muscle fibers? The external cueing, moving the weight as fast as possible, crushes the mind-muscle connection when we look at muscle activation studies. So again, all this bullshit. Studying ineffective training to see how much ineffective training you need to produce the most muscle growth. I mean, this is mental masturbation. It's a waste of damn time, and it's a waste of grant money. That's what it is. It's wasteful. That's my take on it. And we don't learn anything useful. All we learn is that less effective training requires more volume to get maximum muscle growth. Well, no shit. I could have told you that. I could have told you that without a study. Didn't need to waste $100,000 studying it to find that out. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.